Big Shaq was just enjoying a peaceful afternoon when he saw something that made his blood boil. A group of cops laughing while evicting a blind veteran from his own home. The crowd watched in shock, phones started recording, but instead of just standing by, Shaq stepped forward with a plan. What he did next shook the entire city, left those corrupt cops jobless, and changed one man's life forever. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. John Matthews sat in his dimly lit apartment, his fingers gently tracing the edges of his worn-out cane. The air inside carried the faint scent of old books and fresh coffee, a comforting presence in a home he had known for years. But peace was a luxury that was about to be ripped away from him. A sudden, violent bang on the door shattered the silence. "Open up, old man! Time to go!" A voice bellowed from outside, followed by muffled chuckles. John's heart pounded. He turned his head toward the door, his cloudy, unseeing eyes widening slightly. His rent was paid. He was sure of it. So why were they here? Before he could stand, the door burst open, slamming against the wall. 3 uniformed officers stormed in like they owned the place. Officer Grant, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent smirk, held up a folded eviction notice like it was some kind of joke. Beside him, Officer Miller adjusted his belt, amusement glinting in his eyes, while Barnes, the largest of the 3, stepped forward and kicked over John's coffee table, sending papers and a half-full cup of coffee crashing to the floor. "Hope you weren't too attached to this dump," Barnes sneered. "Time to pack up and get out." John gripped his cane tighter, his knuckles turning white. His voice wavered, but he held firm. I paid my rent. My check cleared last week." Miller let out a sharp laugh. "Guess it wasn't enough, huh?" John's chest tightened. He had served his country, fought in wars, lost his sight defending freedom, and now in his twilight years, the very system he once believed in was throwing him out like garbage. "I have nowhere to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grant smirked. "Not our problem, Grandpa." The officers turned, casually looking around his apartment. Barnes ran a hand over the bookshelf before shoving it, sending a few old framed photos tumbling to the floor. A picture of John in his military uniform, standing proudly with his unit, landed face down at his feet. Outside, voices began to murmur. Neighbors gathered, watching from the sidewalk. Some whispered in disbelief, others pulled out their phones. Then, a deep, commanding voice cut through the noise like a blade. "That's enough." The officers froze. The smirks vanished. The crowd parted slightly, revealing a towering figure standing with his arms crossed, eyes locked onto them like a predator spotting prey. Shaquille O'Neal had just entered the fight. Grant slowly turned, his jaw tightening as he realized who he was up against. Grant turned, ready to dismiss whoever had dared to challenge them. But the moment his eyes landed on the figure before him, the smirk on his face wavered. Shaquille O'Neal stood with his arms crossed, his massive frame making the officers look like children in comparison. His expression was stone cold, his glare burning straight through them. The air grew heavy. The murmuring crowd fell into a hush, cameras now fully pointed at the scene. The weight of hundreds of eyes bore down on the officers. Grant cleared his throat and scoffed, trying to mask the nervousness creeping into his voice. "Stay out of this, big guy," he said, shifting his stance. "This is official police business." Shaq didn't move. His gaze flickered toward John, still gripping his cane, then back to the officers. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "That's a blind veteran," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "And y'all are laughing?" Barnes chuckled under his breath. "What's it to you?" Shaq took a step forward. The ground almost seemed to shake beneath his weight. "It's a problem when cowards in uniform throw a war hero onto the street like he's nothing." Grant, still trying to maintain control of the situation, shrugged. "Look, man, rules are rules. He didn't pay up. We're just doing our jobs." Shaq's nostrils flared. His jaw tightened. "Number, that's BS." Miller shifted uneasily. The tension in the air was thick now, suffocating. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were recording. Phones were out, fingers tapping furiously as people live-streamed the scene to thousands of viewers. "Hey!" a voice from the crowd called out. "Y'all really evicting a blind man right now? Over rent he already paid?" Another man muttered, "Disgusting. Bet they wouldn't do this to someone who looked like them." Grant's face darkened. The situation was spiraling out of control. His authority was slipping. Then suddenly he smirked. "Oh, you want to play hero, big guy?" he said, tilting his head. "Fine." He looked at his partners and nodded. "Arrest him." Barnes cracked his knuckles, stepping toward Shaq. "You heard him. Hands behind your back." Barnes stepped forward, handcuffs clinking as he pulled them from his belt. He tilted his head up to meet Shaq's gaze, though it was clear he wasn't used to looking this far up at anyone. "Turn around," Barnes ordered, forcing authority into his voice. For a moment, Shaq just stared at him, completely unfazed. Then he laughed, a deep rumbling sound that sent a ripple of unease through the officers. "You?" Shaq chuckled, glancing down at Barnes. "You're gonna arrest me?" He took a step forward, towering over the officer. "I'd love to see you try." Barnes hesitated. He had arrested plenty of big guys before, but never one like this. Shaq wasn't just tall, he was a living legend. The crowd knew it. The officers knew it. And now the weight of that realization was setting in. Miller nudged Barnes. "Just put the cuffs on him," he muttered under his breath. But before Barnes could make another move, a woman's voice rang out from the crowd. Wait, hold up," she yelled. "Are y'all seriously arresting Shaquille O'Neal?" The second his name was spoken, the crowd erupted. "Wait, that's Shaq? Nah, no way, they're dumb enough to do this. Yo, is this live? Somebody tag ESPN." Phones were raised, streams were rolling. The situation had just gone from bad to viral. Grant's confidence faltered. He glanced at his fellow officers, then back at Shaq, realizing just how quickly they were losing control. Shaq smirked. "Yeah, that's right. Now go ahead. Tell the world what you're about to do." Instead of waiting for an answer, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a single tap, he held it up for everyone to see. The screen flashed to life as Shaq smirked into the camera. "Let's see how your boss feels about this." Barnes stiffened as Shaq lifted his phone higher, ensuring the camera captured every detail of the officer standing before him. The flashing red light on the screen made it clear. This was live, and the whole world was watching. The tension in the air grew thick, the murmurs from the surrounding crowd turning into outright shouting as more people realized what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shaq's deep voice carried authority, calm yet laced with undeniable fury. "Take a good look. These are your tax-funded officers. Right now they're out here, laughing, while throwing a blind veteran out of his home." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Then anger erupted. "This is disgusting!" A woman near the front of the crowd yelled, shaking her head in outrage. "You can't do that to a veteran!" Another man shouted, his phone already recording. A younger bystander, a teenager with her phone raised high, shouted, "Somebody tag the news. Get this viral." Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his once amused smirk vanishing. He wasn't so smug now that every camera in sight was trained on him. His hands clenched at his sides, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. "You really think going live is going to change anything?" His voice held a wavering edge, though he tried to mask it with indifference. Shaq, unfazed, tilted his phone slightly and tapped on his screen. A ringing tone echoed from the speaker, cutting through the commotion. The moment it started, all three officers tensed. "Who's he calling?" Miller muttered under his breath, exchanging nervous glances with Grant. Then after 2 rings, a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Reynolds." The second the name was spoken, it was like the air had been sucked from the scene. Barnes's posture went rigid. Miller's face drained of color. Grant instinctively took a half-step backward. Shaq didn't waste a second. His tone was calm but loaded with weight. "Chief Reynolds, we got a problem." Silence. Then Reynolds' voice came through the speaker. Louder, sharper. "Shaq?" "Yeah," Shaq said, still holding his phone out for the cameras to capture everything. "Your officers are out here about to make your whole department famous in the worst way possible." For a beat, there was nothing but heavy breathing, the weight of the situation pressing down on the officers standing in front of him. Then, Reynolds' voice boomed, cutting through the crowd like a blade. "What did my officers do now?" Barnes flinched. Miller ran a hand over his head, glancing around, looking for an escape that didn't exist. Grant's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Shaq turned his phone slightly, angling it toward the officers. He smirked. "Why don't you ask them yourself?" The phone's speaker crackled, amplifying the tension that already suffocated the air. Every person in the crowd leaned in, their eyes darting between Shaq, the officers, and the screen of his phone. The sheer weight of the moment pressed down on the three cops, their previous arrogance replaced by visible unease. Shaq didn't blink. He simply held the phone steady, his massive arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. Then Chief Reynolds' booming voice filled the air like a thunderclap. "Barnes, Grant, Miller, you better have a damn good reason for this." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. More phones were lifted. Some people were already live streaming, their captions reading, "Corrupt cops caught in real time." Barnes licked his lips, suddenly finding it hard to breathe. His voice cracked as he stammered, Chief, we were just following orders." Miller nodded hastily. Yeah, this was procedural." Reynolds' silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make everyone's skin crawl. Then when he finally spoke, his words were like a blade slicing through the officer's last shred of confidence. "That's what cowards say." The air went deathly still. The crowd's murmurs turned into low chuckles of disbelief. Someone near the front scoffed. "Damn, even your boss thinks you're pathetic." Barnes's fingers curled into fists, his jaw tightening. "Sir, with all due respect," Reynolds cut him off. "Shut up, Barnes. I'm done listening to your excuses." Grant, for the first time, looked genuinely nervous. His gaze flickered toward the growing crowd. His own reflection in a bystander's phone screen made his stomach twist. Miller muttered, barely above a whisper, "We should have just walked away." Too late for that now. A new sound shattered the moment. Distant sirens. They weren't distant for long. The red and blue lights flashed in the distance, barreling straight toward them. The chief was on his way. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the growing crowd. The energy had changed. What started as a routine eviction had spiraled into something much bigger and much worse. He swallowed hard, lowering his voice. "Maybe we should just let him stay." His words barely left his mouth before Grant whipped his head around, furious. "Are you insane?" Grant hissed, his face tight with anger. "We've already gone too far." But Miller wasn't the only one second-guessing. Barnes, normally the loudest, stood eerily silent, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if his body was physically rejecting the reality closing in on them. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were booing, loudly. A woman near the front shook her head, disgusted. "Throwing out a blind veteran? Are y'all even human?" Another man, phone raised, laughed bitterly. "Hope y'all like unemployment, 'cause you're about to be famous." Miller's heart pounded. He could already see it, his face plastered on social media, his name trending for all the wrong reasons. There was no coming back from this. He turned to Grant, desperation creeping into his voice. "Look, man, we don't have to do this. Maybe we—" A loud boom shattered the moment. The sound of tires skidding violently against pavement echoed through the street. A police cruiser came to a screeching halt at the curb. The doors slammed open, and out stepped Chief Reynolds, his face like a storm brewing over the horizon. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The moment Chief Reynolds stepped out of his police cruiser, the crowd went dead silent. The usual murmur of people recording and whispering stopped as if the entire street had been placed on mute. Reynolds wasn't just angry, he was furious. His heavy boots thudded against the pavement as he stormed toward the three officers, his face twisted in barely contained rage. His eyes locked onto Barnes, Grant, and Miller, and with each step he took, they visibly shrank. "What the hell did you do?" Reynolds' voice boomed across the street. Barnes stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Sir, we were just—" "Just what?" Reynolds cut him off sharply. His glare darted to the overturned coffee table, the shaking blind veteran clutching his cane, and then to the massive figure of Shaquille O'Neal, arms crossed, watching everything. Miller took a small step backward, knowing they were screwed. Shaq, still standing protectively beside John, tilted his head. "Chief," he said, his voice calm but dangerously low, "why don't you go ahead and ask your boys why they're out here laughing while throwing a blind veteran onto the street?" Reynolds' jaw clenched. The veins in his temple pulsed. He exhaled sharply, then slowly turned back to his officers, his voice dangerously quiet now. "Tell me, right now." Grant, usually the arrogant one, lowered his gaze to the ground. "We were just following procedure, sir." Reynolds let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Procedure? Is procedure why there are 100 cameras pointed at you three right now?" He gestured toward the growing crowd, phones held high, streaming this disaster live to the world. Miller swallowed hard. Sir, we didn't know it would get... Oh, you didn't know? Reynolds' voice was dripping with sarcasm. He turned and pointed at John, his frail body trembling. You didn't know throwing a blind, elderly veteran into the streets while laughing like a pack of hyenas would be a bad look? None of them dared to answer. Shaq took a step forward, his towering presence impossible to ignore. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Shaq smirked, locking eyes with Reynolds. Oh, I'll be happy to tell you everything. Chief Reynolds stood still for a moment, his jaw tight, his mind racing. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a vice. Around him, the street was alive with a storm of voices, camera flashes, and the heavy stares of an outraged crowd. People were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses, and they were demanding action. In front of him, Shaquille O'Neal loomed, arms crossed, expression unwavering. His presence alone was intimidating, but it was his words that carried the real power. His voice was steady, controlled, but packed with authority. You got two options, Chief, Shaq said, his deep voice cutting through the air like a blade. Either you fire these men, or you deal with me. A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by an eruption of cheers and chants. More phones lifted into the air, recording every second. Barnes, Grant, and Miller, the three officers who had treated John like garbage, stood frozen in place. Their faces were pale, their once smug expressions replaced with pure dread. Chief Reynolds inhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if the pressure of the moment had suddenly tripled. Shaq, listen, he began, choosing his words carefully. I know this looks bad, but you have to understand. Before he could finish, Shaq calmly lifted his phone. The screen was a blur of scrolling comments, outrage spilling over in real time. The number at the top of the screen was impossible to ignore. 9.8 million viewers and counting. Shaq turned the screen to face Reynolds, his tone sharp but calm. 10 million people say you don't need to investigate a damn thing. We all saw what happened. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, his gaze shifting between Shaq and the sea of phones, capturing his every move. The weight of public pressure was undeniable. He could already imagine the headlines, the backlash, the chaos that would explode if he tried to sweep this under the rug. Finally, he clenched his fists and turned to his officers. His voice, once restrained, was now filled with fury. You three, badge and gun. Now. A collective gasp spread through the crowd. The officers' eyes went wide, disbelief flashing across their faces. Barnes, his confidence finally cracking, took a shaky step forward. Sir, you're actually firing us? His voice trembled, a stark contrast to his earlier arrogance. Reynolds didn't even spare him a glance. You heard me. Hand over your weapons and your badges. You're done. The tension in the air exploded into cheers and applause. The crowd roared in approval, their anger transforming into a wave of satisfaction. Barnes's hands shook as he slowly unfastened his badge. The weight of his actions had finally caught up to him, but as he lowered his gaze in shame, Shaq took a step closer. Shaq's voice rumbled one last time. This ain't over yet. Chief Reynolds' voice cut through the chaos like a hammer striking an anvil. His expression was set in stone, his patience long gone. Grant, Miller, Barnes, badge and gun. Now. The three officers stood frozen, as if the words had sucked the air out of their lungs. The weight of the moment crashed down on them like a tidal wave. Just minutes ago, they had been laughing, mocking a blind veteran, thinking they were untouchable. But now, with the entire city watching, their world was crumbling. Barnes's face twisted in disbelief. He took a step forward, shaking his head. Sir, wait. You can't be serious. His voice was no longer filled with arrogance. It was fear. Chief Reynolds didn't even blink. I said, hand them over. The crowd, once angry and restless, now stood in complete silence, hanging on every word. The tension was suffocating. Miller looked to Grant, who looked to Barnes. They were trapped, and they knew it. Their names, their faces, their disgrace. It was all over the internet, spreading like wildfire. Shaq, standing tall beside Reynolds, crossed his arms. A slow, satisfied smirk stretched across his face. Oh, he's dead serious. His deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. Barnes's hand hovered over his badge, fingers trembling. His mind raced, searching for an escape, a loophole, anything. But there was nothing. The law wasn't on his side this time. Reluctantly, he unfastened his badge, his fingers gripping the metal as if holding on to the last piece of his pride. He hesitated. Shaq stepped forward, towering over him. His voice dropped to a near growl. "Do it. Now." Barnes exhaled sharply and ripped the badge from his chest, slamming it into Reynolds' outstretched hand. One by one, the other two followed. The clink of metal against metal was deafening. The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, applause. Someone yelled, "Justice, baby!" Another voice called, "Get him out of here!" The three officers stood, humiliated, exposed, and powerless. Two uniformed officers approached, grabbing each of them by the arm. "Let's go," one of them muttered. As they were escorted to the waiting squad car, Shaq leaned in, voice low. "This ain't even the worst part." John Matthews sat on the curb, gripping his cane with shaky hands. The weight of what had just happened was finally sinking in. For so long he had felt unseen, discarded by a system that didn't care. And yet, here was Shaquille O'Neal, a giant in every sense, standing by his side when no one else did. Shaq lowered himself to one knee, placing a firm but gentle hand on John's shoulder. "You good, sir?" His deep voice carried a warmth that cut through the bitterness of the moment. John inhaled shakily, his fingers trembling as he wiped away a stray tear. I didn't think anyone would stand up for me." His voice cracked, worn from years of disappointment. Shaq's expression hardened, not in anger but in determination. "You ain't invisible, man." His words weren't just reassurance, they were a promise. The crowd that had once been in an uproar now stood in awe. People murmured among themselves, their phones still recording, capturing every second of this moment. The same internet that had exposed the corrupt officers was now immortalizing an act of true justice. One woman wiped her eyes. "That's real power," she whispered to her friend. John exhaled deeply, shaking his head. "They were gonna throw me out like I was nothing," he muttered. "I fought for this country. I gave everything. And they—" His voice faltered. Shaq squeezed his shoulder gently. "Not anymore. You ain't alone, John." A spark of hope flickered in the old man's cloudy eyes, but it was clear. He had lost faith in people a long time ago. Words wouldn't be enough. He needed action. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. The crowd watched, curious, as he scrolled through his contacts. With one tap, he held the phone to his ear. "I got one more call to make," he said, his lips curling into a knowing smirk. John frowned, confused. "Who are you calling?" Shaq's grin widened. "You'll see." The next morning, John Matthews sat in a tiny motel room, his cane resting against the nightstand. He had barely slept. The events of the previous day still felt surreal. The corrupt cops getting fired, the overwhelming support from the crowd, and most of all, Shaquille O'Neal stepping in like a guardian angel. But now, as he ran his fingers over the rough motel blanket, reality was creeping back in. He had nowhere to go. A sudden knock at the door startled him. John hesitated. No one ever came looking for him. His heart pounded as he gripped his cane and shuffled toward the door. With a deep breath, he cracked it open. Standing outside was a well-dressed man in a sleek gray suit, holding a thick folder of paperwork. Behind him, just a few feet away, was Shaq, arms crossed, grinning like he had just pulled off the greatest play of his career. "Mr. Matthews?" the man in the suit asked politely. John nodded slowly. "Yeah, who's asking?" The man extended his hand. "I'm David Coleman, a real estate attorney. Mr. O'Neal asked me to come by." John's brows furrowed. "Real estate attorney?" Before the lawyer could answer, Shaq stepped forward, dangling a set of keys in front of John. "Yeah, big man," Shaq said with a smirk. "You own a house now." John froze. His grip on the doorframe tightened. What?" Shaq held out the keys. "Your mortgage, paid in full. Taxes, handled. Utilities, covered for the next year." John blinked, his lips trembling. "You're joking." David smiled warmly and flipped open the folder, revealing official property transfer documents. "This house, sir," he said, pointing to a picture of a beautiful, single-story home, "now belongs to you, free and clear." John's breath hitched. His knees buckled slightly, and Shaq instantly caught him before he could fall. "Steady, big guy," Shaq murmured. Tears welled up in John's eyes as he ran a shaky hand over the paperwork. His voice came out barely above a whisper. I ain't never owned nothing in my life." Shaq chuckled. "Well, now you do." John let out a choked sob, covering his face as emotion overtook him. Shaq patted John's back. his voice low and firm. Come on, let's go see your new home. Months had passed since Grant, Miller, and Barnes had been publicly humiliated and stripped of their badges. The once confident officers, who had laughed while throwing a blind veteran out of his home, were now desperate men struggling to find work. No police department would touch them, and every background check led to the same conclusion. Their past had caught up with them. Now they stood inside a small, locally owned grocery store, shifting uncomfortably as the manager reviewed their applications. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting an unforgiving glare over their slumped shoulders and anxious expressions. Grant, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt that barely fit anymore, cleared his throat as he watched the manager's eyes move across the page. Miller and Barnes, standing beside him, remained silent. They had already been turned away from every job they had applied for: security firms, retail stores, even delivery services. They needed this. The store manager, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and deep lines of experience etched into his face, finally looked up. His expression shifted from indifference to something far colder. "Wait a second," he muttered, narrowing his eyes as he studied them more closely. His forehead creased in recognition. "I know you." Grant's stomach dropped. He tried to keep his voice even. "Sir?" The manager leaned forward slightly, now staring directly at him. "You're those cops, aren't you?" A heavy silence settled between them. Miller's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Barnes stiffened. The manager scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. "Yeah, I remember now. You threw a blind veteran out of his home and laughed while doing it. The whole country saw that video." Grant's fingers clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Look, sir, we just—" The manager cut him off before he could finish. "You what? Just made a mistake? Just followed orders?" His voice was dripping with disdain. "You're not getting a job here. Get out of my store." The words hit like a slap. Miller and Barnes exchanged a hopeless glance before turning toward the exit. Grant lingered for a second longer, his pride warring with reality, but there was nothing left to say. Shoulders slumped, he followed them out. From across the street, inside a sleek black SUV with tinted windows, Shaq watched everything. He had been keeping an eye on them, curious to see what kind of life they had built for themselves after being stripped of power. Now, as he watched them step onto the sidewalk, humiliated and jobless, a slow smirk spread across his face. He shook his head in quiet satisfaction, leaning back against the leather seat as he murmured to himself, "Karma, baby." As the three disgraced former officers walked away defeated, Shaq turned the key in the ignition and pulled off, knowing that justice had been served in the most poetic way possible.